We continue our series Conscience in Action, part 7 of 7 parts. In 2007, the AACE, the Association of Australian Christadelphian Ecclesias, published a book entitled Conscience in Action, which was well received. We're fortunate enough to have a recording of these personal experiences and testimonies, and many of these were on a CD which accompanies the book, and that book's still available. These recordings are the basis of these episodes of the Wilderness Conversations. This final episode focuses on the role that advocates played in the preparation and on the day of the court hearing. Such an important help for young men, some who were still teenagers and most who had never seen the inside of a courtroom. Brother John Boardman lives in Melbourne, and he shares his experiences and also the ongoing work of the Victorian Matters of State Committee on behalf of our brotherhood.
I've spoken to a number of young people about military service and matters of conscience generally, not just limited to military service. But in the presentations that we've had, the likes of youth conferences and that sort of thing, I find that a lot of young people haven't really thought about the matter in depth. They're familiar with the scriptural requirement that we shouldn't take life. They haven't necessarily thought about what position they might be in if war were to break out. And one of the things is what sort of activity they might feel comfortable being involved in, such as non-combatant duties. We saw in Test Case Canada that the issue of whether a person was prepared to wear a uniform or not, the comments of one brother were used against another, and that to some extent it caused a great deal of difficulty. And to form a conscience, you need to think about these things for a period of time. You can't just form a conscience in 5 minutes, because if somebody throws a curl ball at you and you haven't sort of thought about it, then I suppose really you're caught on the hop, and you might say something that after more thought later you might change your mind. One of the areas that we sort of talked about is in their occupation. If somebody was a mechanic and they were offered a rather lucrative contract to repair army vehicles, such as jeeps, maybe not tanks, but just jeeps, or even normal vehicles, would they be prepared to do so? When you extend that a little bit further, you might be making components for radios, electronic equipment which could be used in navigational aids, could be used in munitions. I suppose the old days of munitions manufacture was fairly simple. It was gunpowder and all those sorts of things, whereas nowadays it's far more sophisticated than that, and that there would be a lot of industry that would be involved in the war effort. The other thing is, in terms of the legislation as it is now written, it throughout the document refers to he or she, and I'm not sure that our young sisters and indeed unbaptised young people who might be of military serving age have been tutored in how they might handle themselves, and whether they have fully formed their conscience as to what they may or may not do. There is no doubt that if there were to be further conscription or further conflict, that it would probably include women. One of the other things that I've spoken to young people about is how they view things, like whether they're into gun sports, whether they frequent movies about war themes, and I've even seen some wedding photos where some people, Christadelphians, have been married in costume wearing a sword by their side. And whilst that might just seem as part of the period costume, I wonder if in a time of war somebody produced a photograph of that young brother with a sword on his side as to whether it would be embarrassing to him. Not only movies, but there is a whole range of media forms, computer games, violent in their nature and involve war games. There are even paintball shooting weekends and those sorts of things which people might get involved with. And it's interesting when you go through and look at some of the questions that were raised during the various times of conflict as to how young people were picked up on their way of life, not only the beliefs that they have. And these are genuine things to test if what you're trying to establish is whether a person has a genuine conviction and has formed a personal conscience in the matter. If the lifestyle is not consistent with the verbal expression of what we believe, then it'll be taken as evidence against the genuinely held conviction. The other thing that I find that young people aren't really aware of is that the onus of proof under the legislation is on the applicant. If the applicant doesn't properly discharge their case, then it's on their head. It's not up to the Crown to necessarily pull the case apart. The other thing that a lot of people don't realise is that the legislation only provides a period of 7 days from the time they're given application to the time they may have to appeal and give account of themselves. And when you consider what's involved in this, it'd be a bit like saying to a young brother, we want you to give a lecture next Sunday, only probably by a factor of about 3 or 4, because what's at stake is critical to them and their life. So that really all of this means that there needs to be thought about the process well before being under a period of pressure. These tribunals are quite expert at trying to define whether or not a person is ruling something off parrot fashion that might have been fed to them. You can't lead witnesses, although these tribunals are set up so that they don't have to stick to the strictures of evidence as would be held in a proper court. But nevertheless, the circumstances are that people will be required to evidence that they have long held these views and that they're their own. So if they're just regurgitating other people's words, it doesn't take long for somebody with some experience in cross-examining to be able to flesh that out. The other interesting thing is when you look at it historically, that legislation changes during the course of conflict. The legislation that's in place before conflict might be quite different. Later, you see during the Second World War that as things became more desperate as far as the Allies were concerned, that legislation became more difficult, and indeed the attitude sometimes of just the tribunals or the magistrates that would be hearing the matter would take a tougher line. So we can expect that if times are tough, then the legislation gets tougher, and of course during time of war, a war cabinet has the capacity to introduce legislation. Has representatives of both sides of Parliament. The Cabinet can actually pass legislation without going through full Parliament. One of the arguments also, I might say, is that apart from the scriptural injunction not to kill, is that part of the reason that we don't fight is because our citizenship is not of this world. And there are a lot of associated issues that go hand in glove with that, where sometimes we also let ourselves down. I sometimes wonder when people look at their worldly associations as to whether they properly think about that. It's of concern to me that a number of Christadelphians, so I'm told by others, and I only know this anecdotally, I haven't met anybody who's put this point of view forward to me personally, but I've heard it said that there are a number of Christadelphians who feel that they have no difficulty in voting. And that does concern me, because I think it helps undermine the overall position which has been taken by Christadelphians generally about being separate and our citizenship is not of this world. In that regard too, we've had through the Victorian Committee for Matters of State queries in relation to Australian citizenship and some of the forms and requirements that are necessary there. And I think these need to be carefully thought about. And indeed, of recent years, the government has made it tougher for residents who are not citizens to be able to access certain benefits, even New Zealanders. Things like Oz study for their children going through university and that sort of thing. So increasingly there is pressure on brothers and sisters, and they do need to think very carefully about these things if we're going to maintain our consistency.
On page 204, a paragraph entitled Advocacy. The issue of advocacy has been crucial in the presentation of court cases over history of conscientious objection in Australia. There has been a shift from reliance on secular solicitors to Christadelphian advocates for court presentations. It was generally recognised that Christadelphians who had legal expertise were able to understand the objectors' cases more fully. Brother Ted Swanberg, based in Sydney, shares his experiences.
My involvement in this course was very early in the piece when I was called upon to register as a conscientious objector. I'd come into the truth from being a member of the Roman Catholic Church. And we were a group of young people who, in those days, before television and even before radio became as extensive as it is, we met together and we discussed matters of moral and national interest. And the Ryans came to live next door. I was at 51 McDonald Street, Lakemba. They were at 49. There were 11 Sponberg children. There were 9 Ryan children. So you can imagine the fence between our two houses didn't last long. There was a back paddock, and we played football down the back paddock. And we discussed matters of common interest. It was the days just before World War II, and everybody sensed that war was coming. We discussed, amongst other things, the truth. And as a Roman Catholic, I defended strongly the Roman Catholic view against the Christadelphians next door, but in the end they won, and I was baptised. I was baptised in 1940. As a matter of fact, Bruce Philp and I were baptised on the same night in the bathtub at Charlie Wiley's home at Benaroon Road, Lakemba. And it was a fantastic experience. Of course, I was disowned by the Catholic Church and by my own family, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, I was a member of I was in the public service at that time, in the Lands Department, and my father went to the Chief Inspector of the Lands Department. His name was Kinsella, and he arranged within 2 months of my baptism for me to be transferred to Grafton, away from the Christadelphians, where I'd be away entirely from their influence, and maybe I'd come to my senses. I didn't come to my senses, and when war happened and the legislation requiring registration of conscientious objectors, I duly registered. And eventually my case was heard. By that time I'd shifted from Grafton to Parkes, and after a period to Bellingen rather, and from Bellingen I went to Parkes. And whilst I was in the office at Parkes, which was a combined office, the Crown Land Agency and Clerk of Petty Sessions, I was called upon to answer to my conscience as a registered conscientious objector. The magistrate at that time, of course, was a very nice person, but he also had the disadvantage of having been married to Winston Churchill's daughter. There was no way in which he was ever going to grant anybody conscientious objection. So when my case came before him, I stood alone in a strange place without other Christadelphians being present, and I was duly registered as having heard, he said he didn't think anybody was ever fully conscientious, and as far as I was concerned, he said he granted me that I was sufficiently conscientious to be given a non-combatant role in the army, and so he registered me as a non-combatant. That was in 1943. In 1943, I duly made an appeal, and the appeal took a long time to process. In the process of time, I was transferred from Parks to the Lands Department, and from the Lands Department I was shifted to the Western Lands Commission, or the Western Lands Office as it was then known. And there I became a deposition clerk. That is to say, I used to travel around the Western Division of New South Wales and with a typewriter under my arm taking depositions before the Land Court. During that time I heard a lot of legal argument, and I was very interested in legal argument. I've always been that way ever since. The time came for my appeal to be heard, and my appeal was heard and it was rejected. And I was duly called up. I was called up for service as a non-competent. I was asked to take the oath. I refused. And I was immediately then called upon to answer a summons to the court for refusing to take the oath. By that time, incidentally, I'd married. I had a young wife, and she had recently come into the truth. We were as poor as church mice. But my case was heard before magistrate by the name of Oram, who was also the magistrate who presided at the coroner's court in Sydney, and I came before him, and I was charged with failing to take the oath. He admitted the offence. He sentenced me to 3 months hard labour in a civil prison. I was accompanied at the hearing by the late brother Jim Mansfield. And I appealed immediately. He said, "Well, you've got to pay a $50 surety, a £50 surety. Pardon me, I'm forgetting my history. £50 surety, and he, I didn't have £50, but Jim Mansfield put in his pocket and pulled out the £50 and said, 'This is it.' So from that moment onwards, I found myself fighting an appeal against this sentence because I'd refused to take up arms. I refused to accept the decision of the court that I was not fully a conscientious objector. I was only a conscientious objector so far as competent service, but not so far as non-competent service was concerned. And we really troweled through the courts from court to court, and eventually I came before a magistrate, the late Judge Markell, and Judge Markell heard me out, and he said to the area officer representing the army, he said, "Look, you fellas, don't you understand that we're in a war effort? Don't you understand the difficulties of fronting us in finding able-bodied men to do a job? This man's doing a job in the public service in which he's doing a very valuable job. Leave him alone." I record the conviction against him, but I defer to sentence. You are released. You understand it. Leave this man alone. I'd refused to take the oath, and because I'd refused to take the oath, I was then charged with refusing to take the oath. That was heard before Oram. On the offence being proved that I refused to take the oath, he then sentenced me to 3 months hard labour. There was a lot of moves that went on, and I do really believe that the angels of God oversee the people of God, and he knew there was a work to be done, and I think he spared me for that work. Anyway, that's part of that story, but Judge Markell was quite an interesting character. He was a liberal. He virtually told the army to back off. He said, "You're being counterproductive. you want me to put somebody in prison where somebody will need to look after him. If I put him in prison, somebody will look after him, I'm hindering the war effort. Don't you fellas understand? This fellow is doing a really good job in his existing position. Let him alone. And I'll record the conviction, but I will not express a penalty. I'll put him on a good behaviour bond, to be of good behaviour for 6 months. But you let him alone. He said, the army said, okay, we'll let him alone. And so from that position, as I recall it, my history was that I went back to my office that day. And when I got back, I was asked by the Secretary of the Western Lands Commission what had happened. I told him. He said, well, I'll have to report that to the Public Service Board, which he did. And then in about a week later, I had a phone call from Dickinson, who was Secretary of the Public Service Board, and he said, I want you to come and talk to me about what happened in court. So I went back to the Public Service Board and I told him what happened, and he said, well, it is the view of the Public Service Board that people in your position ought not to be members of the public service. And I said, well, the view of the magistrate was that I should go back to my position in the public service, do a good job, and help the war effort by not placing additional pressure upon the resources of manpower. And he said, well, I'll report your views to the Public Service Board. Now, the Public Service Board at that time had as its representative, its chief was Wallace C. Worth. Wallace C. Worth was not only chairman of the Public Service Board in New South Wales, he was also Commonwealth Director General of Manpower under the federal government, in which he was responsible for managing the manpower resources of the nation. So I received a demand that I go before the Public Service Board I front. So I went down to the Public Service Board at the appointed time, and I was confronted by the full members of the Public, not Wallace C. Worth and his deputies. And Wallace C. Worth recounted the facts as he understood them of my case, and I assented and said those are the facts. He said, well, Mr. Sponberg, it is in our opinion that you are not a fit and proper person to belong to the public service. And I said to him, well, with respect, Mr. Worth, I said, the magistrate is of opinion that I am a proper person to belong to the public service. He said, do I understand then that you refused to resign? I said, no, I don't refuse to resign, I elect to remain. And he said, we can, of course, dismiss you. Well, I said, Mr. Worth, I said, that, of course, would be a prerogative that you exercise, if you exercise it. And he said, well, we'll give consideration to this and we'll let you inform you. And he said, in our view, you are not a fit and proper person to belong to the public service of this state. I said, well, thank you very much for your views. I'll take them on board. He said, you're dismissed. So I walked out of the place and about a week later, I received a notice from the Public Service Board to say that I was being freed to do work of national importance. And then I received a directive from the Director General of Manpower. He'd changed hats. He was no longer chairman of the Public Service Board. He was now Director General of Manpower. And I received a directive from the Director General of Manpower to report to Wunderlich Limited, who made tiles, roofing tiles, to report there as a labourer to do work there of national importance. Now, this was another roll of the dice. This was the game of politics. This was politics as she is played in accordance with the public service routines at the time, as directed by Wallace C. Worth. And naturally, I consulted with my brethren at the time, and in particular with my long-standing friend, Brother Bruce Philp, who at that time was in the Department of Conservation. I sometimes use conversation instead of conservation when I'm thinking of Bruce, because Bruce was a great talker. Anyway, Bruce and I were buddies, and we'd been baptised together, and so I conferred with him, and we decided that we'd take him on, that Wallace C. Worth. That there was no point in defeating the army if you couldn't defeat also a senior public servant, one of the acolytes, one of the lesser identities who had no real basis for his activity, whatever, and he was acting in a spirit of pure vindictiveness. So at the time, one of our sisters, Sister Taylor, who was one of the sisters of Brother Cecil Watton of the Campsie Ecclesia, she was working for a politician by the name of Mulcahy, who was the local member for Lakemba, where my family lived, you see. And she suggested that I should contact Dan Mulcahy. So I went along to Dan Mulcahy and I said, "This is the situation." I said, I've been to the court. The court has said, go back and do a job. The chairman of the Public Service Board says, we don't want you. I said, that, in my opinion, is acting out of a spirit of pure vindictiveness. The court says, Judge Markell said, go back and do a job. At least you'll be contributing something to the war effort. You won't be at least using other labour for the purpose of keeping you under control or watching over you. And to me, I said, that makes sense. So Dan Mulcahy said, son, you leave it to me. Now, at the time, of course, the Attorney General and the federal government, the Labor government, was in power. The Attorney General was Dr. Evatt. Dr. Evatt was notable for the fact that he was the president of the United Nations organisation, which made it possible for the recognition of the State of Israel, because he was the one on whose casting vote the State of Israel came into existence. And Dan Mulcahy went to Doc Evatt and said to Doc Evatt, look, this is what they're doing to this young bloke. He's a member of my family. This family has made it labour all their lives, good Roman Catholics. You look after him. And Doc Evatt sent me a telegram to say, you can ignore the directive to report to one, go back and do your job. So I went back to the public service. I went back to the Western Lands Commission, where I was located then, and when I got there, I reported the fact, what had happened to the Secretary of the Western Lands Commission. His name was Archibald Roberts, and I took my place in the office and went to morning tea. And when I got there, there was a great silence. But one man who was what we called a retread at the time, he'd been working in the Department of Youth and Community Services. In fact, he'd been in charge of the Parramatta Girls Industrial Home. He was a real flag waver, and he said, I refuse to share morning tea with this yellow-bellied scoundrel. And he marched out. Nobody said a word. We all went back to our desks, and then I received a deputation from the men who came to me and said, we would just like to tell you that we dissociate ourselves entirely from the remarks that were made by Peake. We don't agree with you, but we admire your tenacity, your courage, and the strength of your convictions. And from that moment, everything was rosy. And my subsequent experience, after I had this terrible experience, I was seconded to work with the Western Land Board. For 4 years, I travelled around the Western Division of New South Wales, taking depositions in court on a typewriter. In the course of that 4 years, I came across a lot of very interesting legal people. I listened to their arguments in court. I did my own research, my own study of the law. I was required to do examinations and legal procedures. And I heard a lot of people who subsequently became quite famous in the legal system, who appeared before our court and whose depositions I took. So I became very, very well adapted to the legal argument. I heard it all.
Yeah. And you were in a position to be able to do that as a Christadelphian, because you weren't making judgments on anybody.
No, I was simply taking evidence in court. I was the dispassionate observer. I was the facilitator, the person who was listening to the arguments and writing the arguments down, noting the arguments and pursuing the arguments in my own mind, knowing which arguments were used, which arguments were left. And it was a very preparatory and a providential part of my own life, because I'd been there. I'd suffered the consequences of a failure to adequately prepare and a failure to understand exactly, because I'd come into the truth raw from a Roman Catholic background. I didn't have a Christadelphian background. I think my background in the truth was mainly a study of the book of Daniel with the late sister Ryan at 49 Kemper Street, Lakemba, McDonald Street, Lakemba. And she and I studied together Dr. Thomas's exposition of Daniel. That was my primer to the truth.
Could I just ask another question there? But one of the things I've come across is the mild controversy about the relationship between having legal people such as Groven and Francis represent Christadelphians in court, and to the extent we should use Christadelphians as our brethren as advocates. Do you have any observations on the efficacy of either of those?
Well, actually, this is an issue with which we were deeply concerned at the time. To me, it seemed extraordinary that we had no people who were of sufficient legal ability to be able to deal with their own people. We had to rely upon people who were outside the truth in order to. Francis and Francis was quite they were quite a good firm. There's no question about that, and no doubt they had the interest of the Christadelphian folk at heart. But in the view of both Brother Bruce Philp and myself, they were totally inadequate when it came to presenting the essence of the truth position. I mean, the truth position really is not that we are conscientious objectors. We're not really conscientious objectors at all. We're people who are under law. The law says thou shalt not kill, and we don't. If the commandment that Christ tells us in future that we shall kill, it will be a case of cursed be the man that withholdeth his hand from killing. So we're not really conscientious objectors. Well, that's a name which the authorities choose in order to describe people who don't agree that they should go to war. They object, and they have a conscience about it. Well, we don't really have a conscience against killing. What we have a conscience is about obeying the law, whatever the law is. Whatever the law is. I mean, if God says kill, you kill. God says, refrain from killing. We have no innate behavioural objection to killing unless God commands it. So we're really people who are under law. That was our position. And Bruce and I, we were buddies, of course, and we argued this position. We used to go for walks in the botanical gardens. Bruce would leave the Department of Conservation, alias Conversation, and I'd leave the Western Lands Commission. We'd have lunch out together in the gardens. We'd walk through the gardens and we would discuss this issue. And we decided a long time before Francis his services were dispensed with, that it should be dispensed with, and that Christadelphians should arm themselves with the necessary legal expertise in order that they should handle their own cases. Not only would they be saving money, they'd also be saving their souls. And so Bruce, of course, was the first advocate, and a brilliant advocate he was too. He was a most brilliant advocate. And he was totally fearless in his attitude towards standing up for the truth. And no matter how big they were, how harder they fell, as far as Bruce was concerned. And he and I worked together on these cases, and we decided that the time had come for Christadelphians to handle their own cases. And because we were only acting for what came before us in Sydney, we realised that brethren elsewhere were also doing effective work in whatever sphere they chose to operate. But as far as we were concerned, we had determined that the case that came to us would not be represented by Francis. We would do it ourselves.
It seemed to me that they were useful in terms of negotiating with government as distinct from representing in court. Do you think there's a distinction there, or is it only my imagination?
I think it's a matter of your imagination. If you're sort of in government, you receive a letter. Doesn't matter who the letter comes from. It's the substance of the letter that matters, not the person who writes it. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty of handling cases before court, they were as lost as anybody was. There's no one who could adequately represent the Christadelphian except a Christadelphian who was informed. The only thing that a Christadelphian lacked was his expertise in being able to handle the laws of evidence. And that was a trap, of course, into which most of us fell. We had all sorts of difficulty when it came to cross-examination and re-examination. We sometimes fell into the trap of not being able to ask the right question at the right time. But that was a minor consideration. The major thing was that we were able to represent the people who we knew the truth and they knew the truth, and we were able to advise them on the pitfalls that might befall them when they came before the authorities. Yeah, well, the Second World War period was a difficult period and for a lot of people. But fortunately, as far as we were concerned, by the time the Second World War was over, I think established a position in the before the authorities, and the authorities were finally coming around to the view that Christadelphians were indeed conscientious objectors, and the attitude towards us, I think, towards the end of that war softened quite considerably. Not to the point where they were prepared to accept conscientious objectors merely on a declaration of intent, but they were prepared to acknowledge that there were certain things which had to be kept in mind, and these things were later enshrined in the National Service Act. The regulation prescribed that there were certain things which had to be observed. Well, the Act itself said that a person whose conscientious beliefs do not allow him to engage in any form of military is, so long as he holds those beliefs, exempt from liability to render service under this Act. But then they wanted to say that it made a distinction about non-competent nature. Here we are. Evidence. A court shall, in determining an application made on this part, have regard, in addition to all other relevant considerations, to the extent to which the evidence the applicant is corroborated, to the period in which the applicant claims to have held his conscientious belief, and the circumstance in which he claims to have informed it, and have continued to hold it, but the court may, if it thinks, accept the evidence, whether corroborated or not. So that was the basic structure of the Regulation 35. Well, the important things were really expressed in that Regulation 35. They had to satisfy the court. See, the court shall, it wasn't a case of may, the court shall is the operative word, shall, in determining an application made under this part, have regard, in addition to all other relevant considerations, to the extent to which the evidence of the applicant is corroborated. That's one. Corroboration to the period in which the application claims to have held his conscious belief and the circumstance in which he formed it, but and to have continued to hold it. See, it really homed in on the entire case. What were the circumstances in which you claim, or did you wait until you got the call up before you did anything? Or were you a Christadelphian from way back, from tours? Were you aware of this issue before you became a Christadelphian? Was this a determining factor in making your decision to become a member of the body? These were things they homed in on. Regulation 35 under the National Service Regulations was really the determining factor in deciding how you're going to present a case to court. You had to satisfy the judge in terms of that regulation. There were four main considerations. Number one, the extent to which your evidence is corroborated. Have you got a witness or witnesses? Two, the period in which the applicant claims to have held his... How long have you been a Christadelphian? How long? The circumstance in which you claim to have formed it. What were the underlying circumstances which led you to this belief? Four, have you continued to hold it? Do you attend the meetings? Do you attend Bible classes? Do you attend study groups? Do you associate with Christadelphians? What sort of a job have you got? Do you work for a munitions factory? If you work for don't come before the court if you work for a munitions factory. Are you a policeman? Don't come before the court if you're a policeman. Are you a security guard carrying a revolver? Don't come before the court if you're a security guard. I mean, they were after tests of sincerity. Now, it is difficult to look into a person's mind and say, you are sincere. You can't lift the skull off a person and look into his brain and take a look at the arteries and the capillaries by which the brain is made and say, yes, he's sincere. There's no scientific analysis by which you can determine whether a person is or is not sincere. Now, the government realised that that was a problem. It didn't want to injure the war effort. It didn't want to injure national security. It didn't want to make it easy for people to have who simply didn't want to do any service at all. It didn't want to provide an out for them. So it devised this system which is based upon the fact of engagement, association, and conduct. And it said that we'll judge you by these considerations. And really any person who came before the court had really to satisfy the court that he fulfilled the requirements set out in Regulation 35 of the National Security Regulations. As simple as that.
To what extent was whether a young fellow was baptised or not, count for or against his presentation in court? Was it an issue?
Well, it was not necessarily an issue because the national security regulations were not built for Christadelphians. They were built for people who claimed to have a conscience. Certainly the person who went under the banner of the Christadelphian but was not baptised faced an added difficulty. He had sufficient conscience not to go into the army, but he didn't have sufficient conscience to be baptised. There was a problem. Now, it was not an impossible problem, but it was a problem.
Seemed to me in a lot of the depositions they didn't make too much of an issue of that.
Well, they weren't aware of it. I mean, they didn't realise they were simply ignorant of the fact that baptism was so important in the eyes of the Christadelphian. And I think that the fact to which you draw attention is just part of history. If they had been more informed than they were, we'd have had a great deal more trouble. It was missing from their argument, and we didn't choose to enlighten them either. But that was our prerogative. I know that Curlewis faced a problem because Curlewis himself had a son who was killed during the war, and he himself had been a prisoner of the Japanese in Changi, I think, and consequently he was not the sort of person who would be prepared to see a conscientious objector's point of view. He had an historical bias, if I can put it that way, against granting conscientious objectors, regarded them somewhat as cowards.
What other impressions do you have, Ted, in terms of passing a message on to other young people, whether it's in the courts situation or any general standing up brothers and sisters that you would think would be important for them to consider?
Well, I think it's very important to realise that a Christadelphian is a Christadelphian all the way. That's the main consideration. If you want to prosecute a case before the court in terms of the national service regulations as they existed in history, then you must satisfy, your own conduct must reveal a pattern of conduct which is consistent with those requirements. In other words, you cannot be a one-day Christadelphian. You cannot be a Christadelphian when you come to court and a non-Adelphian for the rest of your service. Actually, the National Service Act was really, when it existed, it was a wake-up call to young Christadelphians everywhere. It was to remind them that they are members of the sect which is everywhere spoken against. It was to remind them that being associated with Christ involves one in a total denial of the institutions of the world. It was to tell them in no uncertain language that membership of the body of Christ required of them a consistency of conduct that they would be true Christadelphians, not just fellow travellers. And that, of course, is one of the great deficiencies of our own age. Our young people don't have to attend before courts and give evidence as to the conscientiousness of their beliefs. They don't. There's no call upon them to do anything in the way of national service. No demands are made upon them. And I think that makes their life that much more difficult. They don't have to stand up for the truth. They don't have to declare it. They don't have to defend it. And they are poorer and weaker as a result. We represented nobody who, in our opinion, or not any person would we represent who would, in our opinion, would fail in the considerations of conscientiousness. We took the view that there was too much at issue to go into court representing somebody whose lifestyle was anything but that of a conscientious objector. There was too much at stake for those who were genuinely conscientious to represent those who were not conscientious. That's really why we conducted classes for the purpose of educating young people in the essential requirements of the Christadelphian case. We had decided that it would be inappropriate to go to court with anybody who was not conscientious. Therefore, we decided that we would monitor the progress of the young Christadelphians in our midst, and we would secure them against the charge that they might not be conscientious. So we met that problem, the possibility of non-conscientious, by insisting that young people come before the class and they subject themselves to the instruction and the debate and the discussion that was involved in the preparation of a case for objection to military service. So we were aware of that fact, and we were unprepared under any circumstance to represent anybody simply because he wanted to escape national military service.
So that was the class was the filter. If they were prepared to go into the class and think through the issues for themselves.
That's right, and the Ecclesias were advised. I mean, Ecclesias was circulated, advised this class was being conducted, and they were advised that young men of military age who were liable to receive a call-up were suitably admonished to attend, and they came along in their droves. But they were made aware of the fact that this was a case which needed to be addressed, and they were instructed in the pitfalls associated, because we'd been there, we'd done that, we'd suffered those pitfalls ourselves. We were not talking through our hats; we were actually talking through the bitterness of personal experience. And we knew exactly what was involved, and we determined that we were going to prevent a recurrence of failure amongst our own young people, if we could. It was up to them. But if anybody attended that class, they knew precisely what was required of them, and they, if the call came, they knew that what it was that was. And it had the effect of strengthening ecclesial discipline. I mean, young people everywhere attended their meetings. They attended not only Sunday mornings, they were there in the evening. They were in Bible class. The young people study classes. They were in everything. And as a result of that, you had a strengthening of ecclesial fabric. The fibre of ecclesial life changed for the better. And and from the moment that the national service legislation was repealed, from that moment, one of the great aids that national service provided for ecclesial life disappeared. Well, what you do, I mean, as a public servant, you're entitled to 15 days, to 3 weeks annual leave. You're also entitled to long service leave, and you took leave to attend court. It was not special leave; it was you took part of your recreational leave for the purpose of attending court. Well, it was just one of those necessary things, you know. Like being a Christadelphian means being Lawrence. It's not just as Donny Hackett would put. You're not a non-Adelphian. You're a Christadelphian. Well, we did have sisters attend these classes. They were eminently for brethren, but sisters also were very much to the fore in the background, and they were also, they came along to the classes themselves as observers, because there was no requirement on national service for women, and consequently there was no call-up of women. But they were aware of the fact that it was a possibility, it was something which was in the background, and there's something that might happen, and they were anxious to equip themselves. They were probably just as much interested in the national service legislation as the men were, but they were not given the, can I say, the privilege of standing up in court and defending their conscience. Well, I think it was a great privilege to stand up in court and to testify concerning the hope you have concerning the world and mankind upon it. I think that it's a great privilege to be able to stand before authorities and to declare openly that you believe in the message of salvation sent by God through his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, and the apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ. It's not a thing to be frightened of, it's a thing to be proud of. It is a wonderful privilege. I think you've got to understand that the New Testament is studded with defences of the truth. I mean, there's some valiant defences of the truth under difficulties. The Acts of the Apostles is filled with stories of the wonderful examples of people who faced extraordinary difficulties, like Peter's address before the Jews of Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. Stephen's defence of the truth in Acts chapter 7. Peter's defence before the Jews in Acts chapter 3. Paul's defence of the truth in Acts chapter 13. Paul's defence before the Athenians in Acts chapter 17. Paul's defence before Agrippa in Acts chapter 26. What marvellous declarations of the people should study. Young people particularly should study the defences of the truth. They're at least half a dozen valiant defences of the truth expressed in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Extraordinary people under great difficulty, under tremendous pressure. People who stood up for God and stood up for his word and stood up for the Lord Jesus Christ. Inspirational stuff. And it never loses its thrust, its value, its verve, its wonder. And you can't read those things without entering into the time and visualizing the impact that those things made upon the people who heard those addresses. One of the things, I think the most interesting things in the Bible is the case of Paul before the group in Athens. He gives a speech, and at the end of the speech, most were dismissive of what is said. But the judge got off the bench and joined him in the dock. Dionysius, the Areopagite. Now, it was the Areopagus, was the court in Athens. And Dionysius, the Areopagite, was the judge. He got down off the bench and joined the prisoner in the dock. I think it's a marvellous presentation.
None of our judges did that.
None of our judges did that, and our judges are the poorer because of it. Yeah.
Brother Peter Hearn, also an advocate, was based in Adelaide.
Well, during the war, in Adelaide there were about 190 brethren over the period of the war, which was 6 years, wasn't it, who were affected by this. Adelaide, there was only one ecclesia in Adelaide at the time with about 500 members. And Gordon Walker really handled the whole thing, but not from advocacy point of view. He did all the preparatory meetings and working with the individual brethren, but certainly in Adelaide, and I think elsewhere, in fact I don't think there was provision for individual advocates other than proper solicitors at that time, but I'm not 100% certain of that. But anyway, we had a solicitor here who represented all the boys in court, and it wasn't until the National Service training came into force that a provision was made in Adelaide anyway for other people to represent them, people without legal qualifications. And during that time, Gordon initially handled them, and then I took over from him. I always felt inadequate for the job, not from a point of view of a spiritual point of view, and probably not from a personal point of view, but from the point of view that I didn't have legal training. And I was always running into problems with the representatives for the National Service Office who would quote legal provisions, and in particular the issues that came up were in regard to asking what they term leading questions. I constantly had problems with that, although in my own mind I didn't feel that it was a leading question, but I didn't feel legally qualified to argue with them. And the other issue that I also ran into real problems with was towards the end, when they questioned, not only questioned, but, well, questioned, shall we say, the matter of the discussions that we had with the boys before the cases. And they said that we were coaching them and that it wasn't their conscience. I had also found that anything that happened in Adelaide, it went the rounds all around Australia. They would send details, and in my own mind I would expect this to become an issue when the matters come up again. I think it needs to be given some consideration as to what involves coaching and what doesn't involve coaching. I always made a point of never telling them how they should answer questions. I mean, I would say, well, this is the sort of question that you'll be asked, tell me what you think about it, or go home and have a think about it and come back and tell me next time. I was really very fussy about not telling them what they should say, but I would tell them if they wanted what was a Christadelphian attitude to certain things, but it gets to be a pretty fine line. The other thing, of course, is that anybody representing the boys has to recognise that it's not his conscience, and he's not there to say what the boys think. He's there to ask questions so as that the boys' conscience can come out. There was another matter that came to my attention. The person representing this particular young brother did not, in fact, comply with the requirements of the Act. The Act required that a certain number of things should be taken into consideration in determining the case, and one of them was the length of time that the boy had had his conscience, how he formed his conscience, the evidence, the extent to which the evidence was corroborated, and those things. And I found that certainly not in any logical way had these points, or not all of the points, had been covered. And I do think that those who stand as advocates for the boys should be very careful to see that they do read the Act and make sure they comply with it. The very fact of having to stand before the courts is not only an ordeal, but I think it's a beneficial thing for the young people themselves. I think it does help them to realise what really, is the motivating principle of their lives. One of the points I always made with the boys was that if they didn't have a conscience, then I would not represent them in court. And one of the things that we should not ever do is to assume that the magistrates will understand us or agree with us. In Adelaide we were very fortunate. I think during the war there were only 3 cases that were lost out of 190, and one of those went to appeal and was granted on appeal. Many of the boys had their employments changed. If they were in what the Manpower Office considered a cushy job, they'd take them out of being, shall we say, an office worker, and some of them got sent down to the railways cleaning engines. Others got sent to fertiliser factory making fertiliser, and others got sent making roads and that sort of thing. Those who were registered as conscientious objector from all types of military service were given the registration conditionally upon them agreeing to do such work of national importance as the Manpower Office directed them to. And the community in general accepted that that was a reasonable thing. I think there was some variation in attitude to some of the work that they were sent to. I mean, some of them went and worked for the Allied Works Council. They were the ones who went up in the Northern Territory building roads and that sort of thing. And I think some people felt they shouldn't have done that, but by and large, it was, well, in Adelaide anyway, that was accepted and it was done by quite a number of brethren. We always emphasised this, that the reason was not that it was not the work that you would do in the army, it was a part of being in the army itself. You were a cog in the wheel, and what is the function of the army? It's the function of the army that was important, not whether you were preparing meals for the troops or running messages or and of course almost invariably they would pick the medical corps, medical service as the key issue. And it's not a matter that you have any objection to doing medical work, and you would be prepared to assist somebody if he was a soldier, as long as you did it in a entirely civilian capacity.
In Tasmania, Brother John Kershaw was an advocate.
1961, one of our young brethren, John Bracey, got balloted in. We got about 5 young brethren. I rang Ted, who'd been taking the cases in Sydney with Bruce, And so he said, look, get in touch with the Crown Solicitor's Office and tell them you'll be acting as authorised agent. Go to the Clerk of the Court, tell him the same, and also tell him that John will make an affirmation, so he's got it there. Go to the Ministry of Labour and tell them also that you'll be going as authorised agent. And they come to the day of the court, and there's a group of us standing in the foyer, and this young fellow comes up and he says, "Are you the Christadelphian?" He says, "Yes." "Mr. Kershaw here?" "Yeah." "Oh, Mr. Kershaw, done this before?" "No." So he explained everything we've got to do, And we should write and send Ted had explained them. And then we went round and we got some of the brethren there, and two were going to be witnesses, Frank Bracey, John's uncle, and Frank Onley. So when he got to Frank Onley, he said, "Oh, Onley, any relation to Margaret Onley?" "Oh, yes, she's my eldest daughter." "Oh," he says, "we were in college together." So anyway, the case began. I cross-examined John and it went through. It took 2.5 hours, this case did. And John got his exemption all right. When he sat down, he was sitting there on the table. The Minister of Labour bloke was sitting there. I was sitting here and John was sitting here. He sat down and he turned to the Minister of Labour bloke. He says, "Bracey was convicted of a traffic offence 6 weeks ago." He'd never raised it in the court. Right? Questioned both the witness brethren very carefully on John's involvement ecclesially, and on his lack of outside activity, see. So we left the court and went down the main street with Mitchell, and he said to me, he says, "Look," he said, "one of the greatest things that would have strung the case in this case was the fact that you would withdraw fellowship." And then when I left him, he says, "If you want any help in future, Mr. Kershaw, don't hesitate to get in touch." Well, 2 years later, I got a phone call from Hubert Taylor, my brother-in-law in Tasmania. He said, our Stephen's been balloted in." I said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "He's going to take the case." He said, "I'll take it. Will you come as a witness?" I said, "Yeah, sure." Comes the day we're in court with Stephen got in court. I'm not in the court, see. I'm just outside and I get called in as a witness later on. So Mitchell says to me, "Oh, Mr. Kershaw," I said, "what would your community do if one of your people joined the forces?" I said, "We withdraw fellowship." He said, "Thanks very much," and sat down. Now, what had gone on and I wasn't aware of was that Hubert had cross-examined Stephen with virtue of the same cross-examination that I'd done for John. And Stephen, again, was, his whole involvement was the truth. Like, he got nothing outside, but he was deeply involved in the activity of the truth, you see. And so apparently what happened was that when Hubert had finished cross-examining Stephen, the magistrate invited Mitchell to do it and he declined. He said, "But I would like to call..." So the magistrate apparently said, "Well, are you conceding this case?" He said, "Well, I would like to call a witness." And I was the witness, and I said, but Stephen got his exemption on that. Several years later, on Saturday night, I got a phone call from Stephen. Oh, we'd just been having by that time, Stephen and Hugh had moved up to Launceston. We'd been out about having a Bible exhibition. He says, "Who came in?" I had no idea. He says, "Mitchell and his wife." I said, "Oh, yeah." Both John and Stephen, their ecclesial involvement could not be questioned. If they'd have been mixed up with the world, the story would have been quite different, I can assure you. Because while Mitchell was helpful, he did his job well. And but he examined them quite closely about John's involvement in the truth and his background in the truth, of course. And then with both of them, he raised the issue of withdrawal of fellowship. Make sure you are ecclesially involved, apart from attendance at meetings and whatever comes your way. If you can get involved in any ecclesial activities, work, do so. And don't get mixed up with anything in the world. Well, let's face it, we're not pacifists. We're only for the time being I would do adopt this attitude. My own case was 1943, 23rd of July. The tribunals were conducted by King's Counsel, or Queen's Counsel, or King's Counsel it was then. My own case didn't go that long. They didn't go very deeply into my own background, apart from the fact that I'd been through Sunday school. And my own case only lasted about 20 minutes, I suppose. They asked me what I'd do if somebody attacked my mother, and I said nothing. Which wasn't a very good answer. I think the real answer should have been, well, I know what I ought to do, but well, it would not might be a different matter. But I mean, I was a kid of 19 or 18, I mean. But then I just got land work, which was, nothing like some other brethren had. My own ecclesial involvement had been, right from the word go. We've been deeply ecclesially involved.